Hi, Adam. How are you doing?
Hey, how's it going, Peter?
It's going well. Nice to talk to you. So I think we're supposed to talk about healthcare, about the individual mandate today, about the ruling
Yes.
in Florida.
Mm-hmm.
So for those who may have missed this, I assume most people know by now, but Judge Vinson in Florida, Judge Roger Vinson, ruled in favor of the 26 states who have challenged the constitutionality of the healthcare overhaul. He ruled that the individual mandate to purchase health insurance is unconstitutional, and that as a result, the whole law should be struck down. He said he voided the entire law in his ruling and said that basically he made two arguments. The first was that the administration and Congress had both made the case that the mandate was absolutely essential to the functioning of the law, and that therefore, if you view the mandate as unconstitutional, then the rest of it should go. And secondly, he made the argument. Where was I going with this? The second part of the argument was that basically that if he took out that the whole law was sort of like a clock. It was or like a watch, I believe. Sorry, it was a very sort of complicated piece of machinery, essentially. And that if you take out one part of it, then you don't know what's going to happen with the rest of it, and that judges should not be in the business of rewriting laws and sort of of doing that rewriting that would be necessary. And so what he said was, because it is so complex and so interlinked, I am going to go ahead. I'm going to void the whole thing because the one part I believe is unconstitutional. And so that was sort of the big healthcare news this week. And I know you've written a bunch about this. I've written a bunch about this. I think I guess I sort of have an opening question for you that I know you've paid attention to, and the issue that sort of what it always boils down to whenever I see these arguments happen. If you look at the Senate held a hearing this week on the constitutionality of the mandate, the question that it always comes down to is if Congress can force people to purchase health insurance, can mandate that nearly everyone purchase health insurance, as this law does, then what can Congress not do? Can it force you to purchase broccoli? And you wrote about this, and you sort of said that liberals need to come up with a better answer for this. I'm not sure that they have. I guess I'm curious.
Is
the broccoli mandate legal?
I don't think.
Should we be worried about it?
So I don't think we should be worried about the broccoli mandate. I actually thought very hard about the and I decided that there was a circumstance under which a broccoli mandate might be legal, and that's if there was a zombie apocalypse and they found out that the contagion could be contained by eating broccoli. You wouldn't become a zombie if you ate broccoli. Then maybe Congress could a broccoli mandate might be constitutional. But I think it's very true that this question of if Congress can can tax you into purchasing health insurance, what can it do? I think that argument has a lot more weight. The slippery slope argument has a lot more weight than in the sort of political arena than liberals have really acknowledged. And I think it's a genuine problem that there isn't that they haven't come up with a sort of an easy answer to that question. But I think it's also partially because the whole point of the mandate is that from a liberal's perspective, it's the health insurance market has certain unique aspects to it, and so to deal with things like adverse selection and guaranteed issue, and preserve the private insurance market, you need a mandate, because otherwise everybody's going to just sign up as soon as they get sick. And I think part of the problem here with liberals coming up to an answer to this question is that liberals don't really like the Affordable Care Act that much. It's a compromise for us. We would have been happy with Medicare for all, or something that just completely wiped out the private insurance market, and the government agreed to provide health care. I think that's something along the lines of what liberals actually wanted, and instead there was this compromise proposed by Republicans in the early 90s as an alternative to Bill Clinton's plan, where the private insurance industry gets to survive, but you get taxed if you don't buy health insurance. And I think the point is, conservatives have taken an argument that libertarians have been making for a really long time about the breadth of the Commerce Clause, and it's very simple, it's very first principles, it's very easy to repeat, it's very easy to understand, and liberals can't respond to it partially because they don't really like the law that much. And the principle for them is not so much about preserving the mandate or preserving the private insurance industry, which is what the mandate is about. It's about making sure everyone gets health care. And that's the part that liberals are really passionate about.
So, a couple of responses there. To your last point, that the law is really about ensuring that everyone gets covered. It's not entirely clear to me, just from a sort of policy perspective, that if you got rid of the mandate, that if you just excised the mandate, let's just say that happened, it's not entirely clear to me that you would lose that much coverage. Some, certainly, but how much, I don't know. Now, CBO says you'd lose about half of the 32 million. The expansion is supposed to, the PPACA is supposed to cover 32 million people, and CBO says that without the mandate it would only cover 16 million. Effectively, you'd be down to the Medicaid expansion.
Right.
But the thing is, I'm not, if you look at, Ezra Klein did an interview the other day with the Republican policy guy who came up with the individual mandate in the early 90s, and the whole idea of the mandate, he said, was to sweep in the remaining few people who would who needed to be swept into the system after you picked up most of the people with subsidies. And the law, and so we've never had a situation where you've had community rating guaranteed issue and subsidies for the middle class, which is what we would have here. And so it's not clear to me that you wouldn't still drastically increase coverage both through Medicaid and through the subsidies, even if you did nothing to replace it. And that also and then that's the other thing, is that you could potentially, I'm not necessarily in favor of this, but it's at least theoretically possible to replace the mandate with some sort of incentive rather than a penalty.
Yeah.
You might also do something where you say, we're going to withhold federal funds from states unless states impose a mandate. And you would probably end up with some states that didn't have a mandate, southern states, sort of more conservative states. But many states would end up with a mandate, in the same way that Ronald Reagan did with highway funds and the drinking age. And because there's no constitutional, maybe I have other problems with states imposing mandates, but there's no constitutional problem, as far as I'm aware, with a state imposing a health insurance mandate. That's why no one's challenged Massachusetts on those grounds.
See, I understand that from a legal...
So it's at least theoretically possible that the mandate could go, and you could retain much, if not, the bulk of the coverage under the PPACA.
Well, okay, a couple of things. I think that it's true that the mandate isn't necessarily the end of the law entirely, unless the Supreme Court really does throw it out. But from a legal point of view, I actually don't understand the philosophical. Separate from a legal point of view, I don't understand the sort of philosophical objection to the federal government taxing you if you can't buy health insurance, but a state can do it. Like, I don't understand if this is from not necessarily from a legal or constitutional point of view, but from a sort of personal liberty point of view. I don't understand why it's not objectionable for a state to do.
I object to it in both instances. It's just that there's a constitutional case at the federal level that just doesn't, as far as I'm aware, exist at the state level. There's the constitutional problems are more clear at the federal level, and at the state level, I would very much prefer that states not have health insurance mandates. However, you can't make the constitutional objection because the states aren't similarly bound.
Well, you could make I suppose you could make a due process or equal protection. I mean, you could, if you really wanted to.
There are other.
You could figure it out.
Other potential objections, but it doesn't apply in the same way. Which, as I said, is sort of is the reason that you haven't seen the same sort of concerted effort to challenge Romneycare, to challenge the mandate in Massachusetts.
See, I would make a different
because
argument.
there are. Cato has, for example, has been at the forefront of of a lot of the individual mandates, the challenges to the individual mandate. Making those arguments along with Randy Barnett, and Cato, has been very, very much opposed to Romneycare, unlike some of the other conservative think tanks, which, because Romney did it and because Heritage was involved in some of the creation, have had a little more awkward relationship with the Massachusetts healthcare overhaul. But Cato has not launched a legal challenge, even though that's something that they do, even though that's and has not pressed for a legal challenge, in part because the case just isn't as strong at the state level. And so you make policy objections, and there are plenty of policy objections to a mandate. Glenn Whitman was writing about the problems with the mandate years ago, long before, at least a decade, nearly a decade ago, long before Romneycare. But sort of after it had started percolating through the policy wonk system, if you will. But the legal objection just isn't there.
I think there's also
level.
just less political will to fight Romneycare than there is to fight Obamacare. I mean, just in general.
Well, because
I know that libertarians have been were critical of Romney's mandate as well, but I just think that there just isn't a national constituency for opposing Romneycare in the same way there is for opposing.
It is a state that is more liberal than sort of the national median, and it is only one state. Now, it's an important state. It's a bellwether on some policy issues, particularly healthcare, and so if you fight it on those grounds. But because of that, you don't have the sort of the national groundswell that you have against a federal law, and in part that is it. I like I said, I'm opposed to a mandate at either the state or the federal level. However, it strikes me as more objectionable at the federal level, regardless of the constitutional or legal problems, simply because it sweeps more people in, simply because, I've written that I would accept, that I would be interested in, say, letting some states pursue single payer, if you could also at the same time allow other states to radically opt out of Medicaid, of other and try and try state-driven sort of catastrophic plan solutions, that sort of thing. It's not my ideal solution. I'm not really big into sort of saying, okay, go ahead and try single payer, but it strikes me that a federalist option along those lines is potentially it has some potential advantages. For those of us who think that a more market-driven system with fewer mandates and fewer government dollars, fewer subsidies, would actually work better. So there's there's that. There's the federalist argument. There's the lack of constitutional problem, et cetera, et cetera. But however, there is a lot of us, at least on the libertarian side, I don't know so much about where the conservatives fall, but at least on the libertarian side, a lot of us do still oppose the mandates at the state level. I want to go back though to the thing that you said at the beginning. You talked about the zombie problem, or sort of how zombies might make the individual mandate constitutional, and you talked about sort of if there's this idea that you've got broccoli makes you immune to zombie attacks, so the federal government could compel everyone to eat it. But if you look at what Charles Fried said at the Senate hearing this week. So the Senate had a hearing on the constitutionality of the mandate, and they brought in a Harvard law professor, Charles Fried, who worked for the Reagan administration, sort of somewhat more conservative guy, not sort of a down-the-line liberal, who said that the mandate was perfectly legal, perfectly constitutional, and that he also said he responded directly to the broccoli question by saying, "I'm not sure it would be a good idea, might not be advisable, but it would certainly be legal to force, constitutional for the Congress to force people to purchase broccoli."
Right.
He said, however, there's a distinction between purchase and consumption.
Right,
Congress
that's a Bill of Rights
force
violation to force somebody to eat something.
So I'm not even sure that the zombie thing sort of exactly holds up, because the issue would then be, can you force them to consume it once they've purchased it.
Well, the counter argument to the zombie scenario is, I suppose, you probably wouldn't need a mandate if people figured out that broccoli could protect you from zombies. Yes. They'd probably just buy it on their own. But
my antipathy to broccoli would immediately be drastically reduced.
Right,
and I would be stockpiling this stuff.
Right, and the price of broccoli would go really, really high, and I mean, but I guess the point of that, though, was the point of it was to, and I've made this argument before, I think the constitutional argument for liberals about whether or not the Commerce Clause applies here is pretty closely intertwined with the policy argument, in the sense that there's the necessary and proper clause, and as Judge Vinson said, well, you could conceivably force people to buy broccoli as a way to bring down obesity because the socialized costs of obesity affect healthcare. And I mean, I think that's a really huge stretch. But mandating people buy broccoli doesn't actually make people skinnier in any way, because it just doesn't. I mean, people don't have to eat it. Even if they do eat it, they might not necessarily be exercising. It doesn't actually directly affect people's ability to get healthcare coverage, or people's or healthcare costs, or in the same way that a mandate does. Like, I think that seemed like a really clever example, but it actually wasn't, in the sense that the whole necessary and proper thing does really matter. It does actually matter whether something is necessary and proper, as opposed to sort of just can the government do it. And I think Fried answered a question that I think Kagan had dodged, and I think that every liberal who has been asked the question had dodged, because they don't want to get caught saying the government can make you eat your vegetables. But the whole point of the zombie thing was to give a sort of really outlandish scenario in which something like that might be constitutional, even though I don't think it's constitutional now under the current circumstances, and that the argument about the mandate's constitutionality is very dependent on this sort of policy history of how Americans have tried to solve the problem of providing health care for everyone while still, leaving it, protecting the private insurance market, so to speak, and that it's not just a sort of frivolous, well, the government can do something, well, that means it may do it at any time.
So, as I thought Judge Vinson's sort of dealing with the necessary and proper clause was relatively convincing. He quoted a bunch of Supreme Court precedents, basically saying something to the effect that the necessary and proper clause has never been an independent source of power for Congress, and quoted Hamilton as explaining that if the necessary and proper clause were in every part, were attached to every the end of every sentence in the Constitution, or if it weren't there at all, it wouldn't make any difference. The Constitution would function exactly the same, and that there's no additional new power, and so that the necessary and proper clause only props up powers that already exist, and so you have to find some other sort of rationale, and so that if you can't actually lean on the necessary and proper clause for saying that the Congress cannot lean on the necessary and proper clause for power, for saying that it has the power to do something. If the power isn't contained somewhere else, then it doesn't have the power, and so the necessary and proper clause only sort of reiterates that it has the other powers that the Constitution says it has. And so so far as the necessary and proper clause goes, I thought that at least was relatively convincing. I don't know, sort of if you have a different perspective. I know you have some different perspective on that, but sort of did you find that at all compelling? I mean, did he get that wrong?
Okay, I'm gonna separate what I find personally compelling from what I think. From the sort of legalese of it, and I think Vinson's ruling is like, as a polemic, is compelling, but like I think when you're this whole question of the necessary and proper, the way that he portrayed the necessary and proper clause is really not how it's been interpreted, like sort of through legal precedent. And what Vinson did was he made a very compelling first principles argument about the necessary and proper clause, but one that was somewhat divorced from like recent jurisprudence in the court regarding Congress's ability to regulate interstate commerce. And this is actually a question that I wanted to ask you. I mean, libertarians have been complaining about the breadth of powers granted to the federal government through the Commerce Clause for years, since Wickard. But I mean, what I guess what I don't understand is,
insofar as libertarians existed,
right,
but yeah.
to the I mean, what I don't understand is, I mean, you know, if the say that the ACA goes to the Supreme Court and gets overturned, I don't understand how the Commerce Clause genie gets put back in the bottle as far as you guys are concerned about it, because it seems to me that Gonzalez v. Raich, which is sort of this case where you know, the Supreme Court decided the government had the authority to regulate non-economic local activity if they thought it would substantially affect interstate commerce, and in this case it was someone growing medicinal marijuana for their personal use. And of course Scalia wrote the opinion in that which says, you know, where the government has the authority to regulate interstate commerce, it can also regulate pretty much anything else, anywhere, anytime. That's not an exact paraphrase, but his opinion was ridiculously broad in that, and you know, from a sort of libertarian perspective, I think. I don't understand. I mean, that doesn't change. I mean, I don't know how, if the Supreme Court decides to overturn the ACA, I don't know how it's going to overturn the ACA and not somehow leave all that toothpaste all over the bathroom sink. You know what I mean? Once you decided that someone, you know, Hudson said, you know, if you're not purchasing health insurance, you haven't made a decision to enter the stream of commerce. But I don't understand how someone who's growing marijuana for their own medicinal use, you know, has decided to enter the stream of commerce either from sort of according to that standard.
So a couple of things there. We have, on the one hand, we're talking about the, how do I say this? The issue here is economic activity is what the Commerce Clause has always been understood to give the Congress the power to regulate. And so if you want to talk about economic inactivity, I would argue that Raich was economic inactivity. And I mean, I certainly think Raich was wrongly decided, and it's a big problem. And you're right, absolutely, that if the PPACA is overturned, if the mandate is ruled unconstitutional, it doesn't solve many of the problems of Raich. So I mean, Wickard, you know, opened the barn doors. Raich let all the horses out. PPACA might bring one of them back in. That's sort of the situation we're at. But I think the distinction we need to make is, let's separate the words economic and activity, because the issue is not even economic activity; it's activity, period, versus inactivity, period. And in Raich, there was activity. There was the choice to raise, to grow your own marijuana for the in that case. And so that was choosing to do something, affirmatively making a choice. Whereas not purchasing health insurance for many people is not a specific choice where you walk up to the kiosk, at the health insurance market, and you say, I'm gonna not buy something, and then you walk away. It's, in fact, you have been doing whatever it is you're doing, and you've not gotten around to buy it. Now, that's of course not true in every case, but in many cases, it's people simply have just not done it for whatever reason. We don't know why. We don't know whether it's an active choice, whether they haven't particularly thought it. And so this is the issue: is can the government then compel you to go ahead to affirmatively do something? And so that's the crucial distinction, I think, between the activity of Raich, which I would say is economic inactivity, but is clearly an activity, versus the mandate, which is not activity in any sense. And I think that, you know, the activity inactivity thing is actually, I mean, it's not quite unanimous, but it really is. There's a strong case to be made. Like there are not a lot of dissenters who really seem to think that it is at least somewhat unprecedented and somewhat novel. You've got, you know, I know Vinson was criticized for including CBOs the CBO and CRS's definition, notes that the mandate was novel and unprecedented, but people were saying, well, those aren't legal judgments, and that's true, they aren't. But I think what he was trying to do with noting that Congressional Research Service and the Congressional Budget Office both have said that this is a novel, unprecedented sort of congressional act, and what he's trying to do is say that, look, Congress's own nonpartisan, folks, research advisors have said that this is a brand new thing, that has not happened before, and what's brand new about it, I think most folks agree, is that it is regulating inactivity, not just economic inactivity, but inactivity, period. And so that, to me, seems to be sort of the core of the problem and the core difference between Raish and this. Although I certainly, like I said, I certainly agree that Raish will remain a big problem and remains a huge defeat for sort of the libertarian view of how to read the Constitution.
I mean, well, I'll say that because I don't think that the distinction between the economic inactivity in Raish and the saying it's activity but not economic activity, and saying that I just don't find that distinction in terms of between Raish and the precedents set in Raish and the Affordable Care Act to be very meaningful, because, like I said, by Hudson's standard, this was a person not entering the stream of commerce, and you said you agree with that, and I know like you said, you have a problem with Raish. I'm just saying, from the perspective of Hudson's opinion, I actually don't. I understand your argument, and I just don't think that Hudson's distinction really makes much sense. And I guess what I'm getting at is that I think if you were going to rule whether or not the ACA is unconstitutional based on sort of the legal precedent that has been set up, this pretty broad Commerce Clause that has been assembled by decades of jurisprudence, I think there's probably no question that it would be constitutional. And I think libertarians have been making for a long time, and it's one conservatives have picked up, that it's important that this be ruled unconstitutional precisely because this has gone too far. But the other thing I will say, though, is I think the Congressional Research Service is actually pretty wrong about that being unprecedented, and there's a couple reasons for it. One is that Americans are generally manipulated to purchase or not purchase things based on the tax code all the time. And I think you go back to, I think Jack Balkin, when he was responding to South Dakota or North Dakota lawmaker who had introduced a gun mandate, sort of as a way of proving that the mandate was unconstitutional. The insurance mandate was unconstitutional. And Balkin pointed out that the Militia Act, signed by George Washington, mandated that every able-bodied citizen buy a gun and powder and ammunition. And when we say mandate, the ACA's mandate is a tax that makes you buy health insurance. If you don't buy it, you get taxed. But this was an actual mandate, like a hard mandate, like you have to do this. It wasn't like Congress will tax you if you don't buy a gun, and that was and that mandate, and that was based on different powers enumerated in the Constitution. But I think the point is the liberal argument about the Commerce Clause, and the one that I think Fried made when he testified, was that if health insurance is a form of commerce, and this is the kind of regulation that is needed to regulate that commerce, then it's constitutional. And it's not, and I think, I think obviously it's a different, and part of what makes it constitutional is that it's unique to this market, and what limits the federal government's powers is the uniqueness of the health insurance market, the fact that you wouldn't have to do this with any other type of market. And I understand why that's not comforting to a lot of conservatives and libertarians, but I think it's a persuasive argument.
But if you think about, say, well, first let me just the Militia Act thing. Right. If you Slate actually did a pretty good piece on this, sort of saying that that argument as an argument for the constitutionality of the mandate is ends up being pretty flimsy. Basically, that
it's based on different
powers. On the militia clause,
right.
And so that the constitutional foundations end up being just sort of independent of each other, and that if one is constitutional, it doesn't mean that the other is constitutional, regardless either way. And so I don't entirely buy that. I think it's interesting. It's an interesting sort of historical point, but it's not much of a constitutional argument.
No.
It's more of a sort of there's precedent in the founders for some types of compulsion in terms of what you have to buy. But that's really all. But as the sort of legal foundations of the Constitution have evolved, I don't really buy it. But the thing is, though, if we think about the health insurance market being somehow distinct. We say, okay, well, it's a federal issue because there's this federal problem, the uncompensated care, whatever it is, and so that therefore the federal government has the power to intervene somehow or another. The problem with that is that there are still a number of other markets that I think a lot of people would be very, very uncomfortable with. That would theoretically give the federal government the power to. I mean, if you look at so the broccoli mandate, if you go back to that, we already have ag subsidies. The government is spending tens of billions of dollars on subsidizing farmers in the American sort of farm and produce market, right?
Yep.
They pay people to grow certain things, to not grow things, whatever it is. So the federal government clearly has an interest in the ag market. If you look at, say, the car market. We effectively own an auto manufacturer at this point, and that is, and so that the federal government has shown an interest in what is clearly an interstate market, in the purchase and sale of automobiles, all those jobs that are tied up in that. So to me, you get it if you say, well, because it's different and because the federal government has some sort of interest in it, that's not. It's not very comforting.
Right.
It doesn't put very many limits on it. And it strikes me that the limit, that sort of the boundaries that set are so wide that most people would probably be very uncomfortable with boundaries that wide, with sort of admitting that the federal government, they could in fact have mandates to purchase this sort of vegetable, that sort of vegetable, for retailers to be buying whatever it is. For people that sort of, you've got to buy this car, you've got to buy that car. We're gonna in order to prop up the American car market, which the government, like I said, has demonstrated a clear interest in, and now has a very clear financial interest in. And so, to me, you don't roll back Raich, you certainly don't roll back Wickard by doing this sort of thing, but you do put a lid on it, on the federal power. To do some things, to intervene in some markets, and to compel individuals to participate in certain types of markets they may not have otherwise participated in. And so to me, I guess that's that is saying that, well, the healthcare market is somehow different. It's different from some types of markets, but there are a lot of markets that have enough of the same qualities that you still end up giving Congress a pretty wide berth there in a way that I think would make a lot of people uncomfortable.
I think that you're right that it makes a lot of people uncomfortable, and I think that that gets back to what I'm saying, is that liberals haven't developed a really effective answer to that question. I think in practice, that's not right. That the health insurance market does represent a fairly unique federal problem that isn't going to be repeated in other markets. But I also think that it's not. We're not necessarily. My perspective on this is pretty cynical. I thought you guys at Reason did a really good video on the Commerce Clause, on the history of the Commerce Clause. And it just sort of struck me.
The one that Vincent mentioned?
Yeah, the one that Vincent mentioned in his ruling. I thought that was a really good video. What I noticed about it is that, what basically happens with the Commerce Clause is, you have someone like Scalia who generally is pretty federalist, talks a lot about, limiting the power of the federal government. But, in Raich, I think what happened was basically he found he doesn't like people smoking marijuana, so he gave a really broad interpretation of the Commerce Clause. And in previous cases, the Violence Against Women Act case and the U.S. v. Lopez case, they found the conservative justices found limits on the Commerce Clause. And I think, regardless of regardless of the merits of those cases, it just seems to me that there's a really strong correlation between when the justices on the court decide to find limits on the Commerce Clause and when those things dovetail with the policy preferences of conservative Republicans. Do you see what I'm saying? It just seems to me you guys make some really consistent principled arguments, and the only time that the conservatives on the court acknowledge those arguments is when they meet a sort of political purpose.
Trust me, libertarians are frequently frustrated with conservative jurisprudence. The first thing I would say is that for the best discussion I've seen of the difference between how sort of a libertarian approach to law and to the Constitution and a conservative approach, you should read my colleague Damon Root's piece, Conservatives v. Libertarians.
I read that piece. It was a good piece.
But anyone watching sort of who wants like a really good, it's like a 4,000 word feature sort of discussing the differences, and sort of here's where libertarians stand, here's where conservatives stand. Conservatives sort of take an approach it's more based on temperament in some ways. Their sort of attitude is, well, let's not mess with too much. And it ends up allowing for a lot more sort of discretion, that sort of, where libertarians are sort of like the judges should enforce the law, and if that means being an activist, that's okay. There's no problem with activism as long as it is in service of enforcing the Constitution. Period. I was thinking about this. Like, this has been one of the big talking points on the left, about these rulings, is that they're just partisan, and that you've got the two democratically appointed judges who ruled in favor of the mandate, and the two Republican appointed judges who ruled against the mandate. And
there's one who dismissed based on standing.
There's truth in it, right? To some extent, and it's not like the judges are writing, well, Bill Clinton appointed me, so I don't. I'm in favor of this, or vice versa. But that this is true. But how do you solve that problem? Judges are going to be appointed by are going to be appointed by elected officials who are either Republican or Democrat. They're going to look for people, in most cases either Republican or Democrat. They're going to look for people who they think will give them rulings that they like. And I just don't. I mean, it's almost like if you somehow or another, if you had a panel of judges on some sort of policy matter made up of folks from National Review and the American Prospect, you would assume that they're going to, that their decisions that they will come up with the best logical case they can make for what they believe. And this is what people do, and I just don't know how to get around this. Maybe it's true to some extent, but then what is the solution that we should... I mean, it's not as if Democratic judges are somehow immune from this.
Right.
I don't know if it was on the plumb line, it may have been, but I saw reference somewhere this week to a study that suggested that about 90% of decisions sort of fall in line with whatever the sort of assumed ideological partisan character of the judge is on both sides. And it's so I don't know what the solution is. The solution for Democrats is going to be appoint more Democratic judges, but Republicans are going to continue to exist and not allow that to happen, and they're going to do the opposite.
Right. I mean, I don't know what the solution to the problem is. I mean, I think Republicans have found a solution to the problem from their perspective, which is to filibuster all Democratic judicial nominees. But I get the impression, and I think Vincent may be an exception to this, but I get the impression that it actually matters when a judge was appointed. I feel like a lot of the more recently a judge was appointed, I feel like the less independent they tend to be politically. I'm sometimes uncomfortable with this sort of judges are partisan argument because I know that there are exceptions to the rule. I mean, someone who comes to mind is someone like Judge John Bates, who is a Republican appointee, who is a very independent judge.
I'm sure that very few think of themselves as partisan, and very, very, very few, if ever, do it at all intentionally, are aware that they're doing it. I don't want to accuse. I don't want to say that judges are sort of answering to their
masters,
their partisan masters. There's no evidence that that's the case, but the human psychology sort of works in subtle ways, and people do. And judges appointed by Republicans. I mean, the evidence is clear. Judges appointed by Republicans rule in ways that sort of fit with Republican preferences, and judges appointed by Democrats, vice versa. Again, how do you solve that? You can point it out. I don't know if you can even, but I'm not even sure I would even call it a problem, because it's not something that I see. It's sort of it's a fact.
I mean, I think,
where do you go once you've discovered this, that people have these preferences, whether they explicitly reveal them or not? Okay, then so what?
I think it's a problem, but I think what's interesting about it is that I feel like it's something. I think what basically happened is, after Roe v. Wade, I think Republicans used to appoint much more moderate judges, and after Roe v. Wade, there became a much stricter ideological policing of who was going to get to sit on the bench. And I think what's interesting is that liberals, despite Bush v. Gore, despite certain decisions that they don't like, have largely sort of abdicated this fight for judicial nominees who sort of share their ideology in the way that Republicans have. And I think it's largely because I think a friend of mine put this to me a few months ago. For conservatives, the apocalypse already happened. And for liberals, the apocalypse hasn't happened yet, so there's a sort of complacency about the court. And there's always a lot more. I think there's always a lot more shock on the liberal side when judges turn out to be partisan than there is on the conservative side. I think what's interesting is that conservatives have developed a really effective legal rhetoric for saying our decisions that we like are the correct decisions according to the Constitution, and liberals haven't really gotten as good at that, in part because this really heated fight over the judiciary is one that they haven't really even shown up to yet, and conservatives have been fighting it for 30 years.
So I guess my sort of I think that may be somewhat right, but it seems to me I would have a couple of qualifications on what you said there. The first of which is that I'm not sure. I think part of the reason that liberals haven't developed as effective an argument is because it's much harder for them to do so. Republicans have basically taken this overly simplistic, I think, line that if you read the Constitution, it means what it says, and this is obviously bunk in some ways. I saw actually like some PhD fellow, whatever, argue with Jeffrey Rosen a couple weeks ago, who basically just said that it's so obvious what the Constitution means, and this is what the Tea Party is about. And I feel like this seems like sort of nonsense to me. That like you can just sort of you can read the words and there's like a clear meaning and that's it, and there's no further anything. There's no further discussion. On the other hand, but it's a fairly effective line, and it's a way of helping people understand sort of how to approach the Constitution that I think a lot of people find very appealing. Whereas the liberal approach to the Constitution, which sort of requires you to, which understands that there's sort of takes for granted that there is that there's changing meaning, that there's multiple interpretations, and that you read it in part as sort of a document in its time, is something that a lot fewer people, that's a little harder to explain, and a lot fewer people are going to be automatically comfortable with. The other thing I would say though is that it's still not clear. You say that liberals haven't adopted the same sort of judge-picking strategy that Republicans and conservatives have adopted. At the same time, though, as far as I'm aware, the evidence is that Democratic judges rule in favor of Democratic priorities. Sorry, I should say democratically appointed judges. Don't mean that they are. Yeah. But democratically appointed judges rule in favor at effectively the exact same rate as Republicans. So it's not as if Democrats don't have, I want to call them their advocates in their court, but they're the people who they've appointed to the judiciary end up representing their interests in the same numbers, at the same percentage as Republicans. So it's not as if Democrats are somehow falling behind or something. It seems to me like Democrats have adopted it enough and are seeing more or less the same sort of results that Republicans are seeing.
Well, there's two things I'll say about that. The ideological balance of the courts right now is very stilted in a Republican direction because there are an incredible number of vacancies that haven't been filled because Republicans in the Senate are doing a really good job of blocking those nominees. The other thing I would say is that that methodology in particular, I think that there are some problems with it. Scott Lemieux wrote a post responding to it, basically arguing that that the methodology depends on looking at cases in certain categories, and that looking at them as different categories of cases actually completely shifts the sort of like if you look at something as an equal protection case, it completely shifts how you would expect the justices to rule based on ideology, as opposed to looking at it as another kind of case. So I think, I wanted to say that earlier, but I think it is difficult to quantify the sort of partisan divide on the courts. But I will say that I generally agree with you that for the most part, both parties are getting what they want, except that Republicans have managed to assert much more dominance on the court in terms of how many judges are conservative, how many judges are Republican appointees, and even sort of, I think even how committed...
Is that not partially a function of elections, though?
That's partially a function of elections.
Once you assume that elected officials appoint these people, then whoever gets elected more often into the right roles is going to end up appointing more people.
But I think if you look at like the way liberals as opposed to Democrats, and I think there needs to be a sort of dividing line there. If you look at the way liberals as opposed to Democrats have looked at their nominees, Democrats, if you're a Democrat, you probably should be happy with the nominees who are on the court. If you're a liberal, you're probably, in some ways, as frustrated with the direction of the court with regards to things like due process laws, as someone like Radley Balco. You know what I mean? Like there's generally been an erosion of certain civil liberties and due process issues on the court that has continued in part because the nominees are Democrats, yes, and on these like sort of big partisan issues they'll go with Democrats, but when it comes to other ideological issues that liberals care about but that Democrats might not care about as much, I think those judges tend to be a lot more moderate than liberals would like them to be. And I think if you look at the Supreme Court right now, it's not a coincidence that the most liberal justice on the court was somebody appointed by President Ford and technically a Republican. The entire sort of composition of the courts has shifted right in a way that I think Democrats are okay with, but that the subset of the Democratic Party that is liberal is not okay with.
Yet another way in which liberals and libertarians are actually allied in deep frustration
yes.
with how both parties are treating the courts.
Yeah. There's a recent case involving...
or at least there's some overlap. Maybe not exactly allied, but there's overlap.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if you want to continue talking about the healthcare stuff.
I think we've covered it.
We have talked for a while about perhaps bringing video games to blogging heads.
Absolutely.
I don't know if there's ever been a blogging heads on video games before, and we're both sort of frequent, regular gamers.
Mm-hmm.
Spend too much time of our time in front of the Xbox. And so I don't know about you, but probably the best game I played last year was Red Dead Redemption,
mm-hmm.
Which you have pointed out has a pretty strong libertarian bent.
Mm-hmm.
It's a game by Rockstar Games, the same people who made Grand Theft Auto 4, just some background for folks who aren't gamers. And the game it's a Western game. It stars a character named John Marston, I believe, who spends most of the game tracking down his former outlaw buddies for the federal government. I believe it's the federal government.
Yes.
For the federal government, because the federal government has more or less kidnapped his wife and child. And so he has to go sort of, he's trying to go straight. He wants to sort of live a nice farm life with his family, and ends up, sort of most of the first 3/4 of the game or so are his mission sort of running around Mexico and the Old West, looking for his old buddies and trying to track them down so he can take them out. But you were the one who actually sort of pointed out the really strong libertarian bent, and I hadn't gotten far enough in the game at that point. I don't know if you sort of want to elaborate on that.
Well, I mean, it's very, almost everyone that the main character encounters is complaining about the heavy hand of the federal government, and why don't they just let us live our lives, and they come in, and they build roads, and all that, but then they tax you to death, and they take your farm. I mean, it was really sort of, it was really interesting. I mean, just how, and of course, there's and I won't spoil the ending just in case there's someone who hasn't actually played it yet, but the ending of the game is sort of explicitly tragic and anti-federal government. And sort of just it sort of meets the theme of the entire of your conversations with almost everybody in the game, which is that the federal government just wants to exploit people, and when it's done exploiting them and taking everything it has, it's going to leave them by themselves with nothing. It's sort of the idea. And I just find that really fascinating, particularly because I frequently see libertarianism invoked in video games as sort of evil. Generally, I think there was a Star Wars game, a Star Wars role-playing game that came out for Xbox a couple years ago, in which the antagonist was sort of just Ayn Rand. Like her philosophy was objectivism,
right?
And she sort of gave these sort of Randy. She's supposed to be your master, your sort of Jedi master teacher, but she keeps giving you these really weird Randian lessons about life and self-sufficiency and virtues of selfishness and stuff like that. And eventually she turns out to be evil. And there are a lot of other games like that.
And there's BioShock,
right.
With where the guy you're running through this sort of this society that's been set up, along sort of explicitly Randian designs. It's collapsed, and you're running through the collapsed version of it. And the bad guy, is the person who set this society up to be sort of hyper-capitalist and self-sufficient. And in the end, he turns out to be not quite the bad guy.
Right.
There's a sort of twist about 2/3 of the way through the game in which he's maybe not a good guy, but he's more tragic, and the actual bad guy is someone else. But yeah, it is interesting. And then I guess I'm curious sort of how you feel about seeing video games address politics like this. You had not just this, but then you had what one website, I forget which one, may have been Kotaku, called the world's most liberal, or the year's most liberal video game was Assassin's Creed Brotherhood, in which one of the side missions, you find out that the bad guys who have been like controlling history, thwarting, all things good, basically, who have been, working for the bad, just whatever the bad is, they've been working for it, in a conspiratorial, evil kind of way. They've now turned into a corporation, and they were partially responsible for Citizens United in that decision. Like an explicit reference to contemporary politics that takes a very clear side, like that's bad, you're good, you're against that sort of thing. I'm sort of curious to what you think of sort of the fact that video games are now bringing this stuff in and addressing this sometimes very explicitly.
I wouldn't. I think Assassin's Creed has very partisan politics, in the sense that it's sort of very critical of Citizens United and the conservative wing of the Supreme Court. But I think what's interesting to me is that the other video games that we mentioned have actually done a much better job of sort of discussing political ideas. So, BioShock is sort of an attempt to imagine a Randian dystopia, a society built, almost entirely on the idea of objectivism that sort of collapses inward on itself because there's nothing there's nothing to restrain people's sort of greed and self-interest. But that's a lot more interesting to me than, finding out that the Supreme Court is responsible for all the bad things in the world. You know what I mean? Like what's interesting to me about sort of something like Red Dead Redemption is the way its politics are perhaps explicit to someone who's very familiar with those ideas, but probably not all that explicit to your average gamer who is sort of getting a sort of amateur political philosophy lesson.
Yeah, I wouldn't even say it's politics. It's the game's ideology.
Right.
And that's what is interesting. And in fact, I mean, if you think about what video games are really good at, video games are really good at portraying a large working world and the sort of interplay between different parts of sort of a functioning small societies. You look at Grand Theft Auto 4; it's this like amazing recreation of Manhattan. It's not actually called Manhattan game, but they based every neighborhood is like a near perfect sort of miniature of the various neighborhoods in New York. If you look at the Fallout games, Fallout 3 is this great sort of post-apocalyptic Washington D.C. overrun with super mutants, not actually that different from our Washington D.C. And so it turns out that video games end up being a really good way to look at social systems, right? And at
particularly markets,
sort of at ideological systems, right? And like how they change the world around you. And so to me, like this is it seems like a really interesting way to discuss some of these ideas and because in some ways they're world simulators, right? That you get to sort of go walk around and play in. And that's what, and when you end up, that's what a discussion of ideology really always ends up being is, what is the world was this other way? And video games sort of give you this opportunity to explore a world that is actually that other way, that is actually sort of dominated by crazy Randian ideas or by post-apocalyptic super mutants.
What I kind of love about all these worlds, though, is that the market economy almost always survives a dystopia. Right, so you
right.
can, if you look at something like Fallout or you look at Red Dead, there's always like this element of in Fallout, which portrays a United States that has been destroyed entirely by nuclear war. People, there's no way to print money, so people, bottle caps are currency. And I think at one point in Fallout, you actually have to destroy a working bottle cap press because it's going to completely deflate the value of the bottle cap. Which is like
they've been printing fake bottle caps. You're not supposed to have any new ones.
Right. I think it's sort of fascinating and I guess very American that even in the face of dystopia, you still have a market system, even with
Yeah. So I mean, this is sort of the kick I've been on with video games for a while is that they actually make not just great social simulators, but really very good economic simulators in many cases. My favorite example was not Fallout, but Fable 2. I don't know if you've played this, but it's a sort of, it's a pretty good, but maybe not great fantasy RPG kind of thing. But the best thing about it is the economy in game. So like a lot of games, you can find objects around the world and then you can sell them at various locations. And there are a whole bunch of little towns that you can go to, and they have little shops. Sometimes they'll have a gun shop, a clothing shop, that sort of thing. But within those towns, each town has an economy that is driven by external events. So if you kill a bunch of people in one town, then the economy gets worse.
The property values go down.
The property values go down. This is the other part of it, is that you can actually buy every piece of property in the game, charge rent, and you can change the rent variously. So you can raise it and lower it, and there are different effects because of that. And you have shortages in certain towns, so you can and you have excess in other towns. So you can go to one town, you can buy up all the guns or whatever they've got in one town because they've got an excess, and so you get a discount. And you can go to some other town, you can sell them and make money this way. And it's actually this sort of great economic simulator. I don't know if you played Fable 3 though.
I haven't played the new one.
Politics. So the new one is really interesting because it brings politics into the mix. It's basically Fable 2 with a different ending tacked on. Like the game is not very different in most ways, but the ending is that throughout the game, after every mission, most of the missions throughout the first part of the game are you have to help some tribe of people, and at the end you help them and you ask them for their support in a battle you want to fight, and they say, okay, we'll give you your support if you promise us to do this thing once you've won the battle and taken the job of king. Because when you win the battle, you become king, right? And so it's about making political promises. Then once you become king, the first day you find out that that there's actually this major threat to your land, and you can't stop the threat from coming, but you can prepare your citizenry for it. However, in order to do that, you're going to have to break a lot of your promises. And so it's this really interesting sort of, am I going to, do I want to fulfill the promises that I made, or do I respond to the external threat that I know is coming? And so that part of it ends up being really interesting, but then you do sort of crazy things like you set tax rates, and they explain to you that if you set your tax rates too high, if you set your tax rates high, you'll bring in a lot of revenue, which will help you prepare your army for the threats. But a lot of people in your will die as a result, like a lot of poor people, and like no thought to like the economic effects of, wait, if I allow a lot of my lower class to die, doesn't that actually make the economy much worse? Doesn't that like like nothing, like no sort of second order effects at all. It's simply like, if you're mean to the people, you bring in money, and that's the one goal, and if you're nice to the people, you don't bring in money, but it helps you win the heart of the people. It ends up being really, really simplistic after this great sort of market economy simulation that they've got going on in the rest of the world.
That's a shame.
Like that, but the idea of like, sort of forcing players to confront the fact that that in order to keep your promises, you may, in some ways, make your world make your society less ready to deal with the threats that it might face is sort of an interesting one. And in the end, you basically have the choice of losing millions of lives to this external threat that's coming, or not losing them, but everybody's sort of in poverty and destitute and hates you. And like, so those are your choices. It's kind of bleak in the way that politics inevitably, I think for a lot of politicians like that, they have these hard choices where it's like, whatever I do, I don't really win.
Well, we actually have a piece, our culture essay in the latest issue of the American Prospect, which you should pick up, is by Monica Potts, and it's actually about how her innate conservative comes out in video gaming. So she talks about how how whenever she plays SimCity, she ends up lowering taxes and like steamrolling low-income neighborhoods to put up high-rises, and just sort of doing it. She's just like a ruthless capitalist. And just totally unconcerned with the plight of lower class people in her city, because if you have lower class people, then you have to put eateries nearby, and you have to have a police station. You have to do all these things that are sort of constructed in a way to sort of push you towards what might be considered traditionally conservative policy choices. And it's all sort of about how she reconciles her personal liberalism with her like inner video game Newt Gingrich, so to speak.
There's some rich conservative funder who's listening to this right now who's going to read that piece and be like, "What I need to do is bring video games to the people and start funding conservative video game production."
Well, see, but that's the point. Is I think in some ways video games are actually pretty inherently. In some ways, they're pretty inherently conservative, and that you don't even actually need to do that. I mean, certainly, if you look at something like Fable, which teaches you very well, which is sort of a great way to introduce someone to, like, first-order concepts of how economies work. I mean, it's certainly there's certainly a way in which I think some video games are stilted towards conservative ideas, but I don't think it's a bad thing. Obviously, I enjoy them a whole lot. I just think it's funny.
I guess to me the problem with a lot of these games is that they give you is that they don't actually give you a reason to care about the digital people that you're supposed to be. That like if you choose the bad route, if you choose to be a bad guy, an evil person, whatever, there's no reason, and because they're digital, they're whatever. There's gain for you, and it may hurt some non-player, sort of computer character, but it doesn't hurt you at all, and so you get some benefit from it. And I guess in that way, it's sort of there's like a built-in incentive towards heartless behavior. That's actually one of the things, though, that I really liked about Red Dead Redemption was that it's one of the few games, and to some extent also Fallout New Vegas, which had a system of alliances with different groups of people, and you had to manage your reputation amongst people, and your reputation if you were doing bad stuff. It mattered, and so this is the thing that I'm really sort of hoping that video games will get into, is that a lot of them have sort of allowed you this option of being bad and given you a lot of rewards for it, but not shown you any of the problems that come as a result of, say, just stealing whatever you want. Sort of when a store owner won't give you a discount, shoot him in the face. Like this whole sort of all the heartless behavior that just sort of ends up being a lark and being beneficial. And that's actually, like I said, Red Dead Redemption. Read somebody, one of the critics writing in Slate's Gaming Club this year, who said that it wasn't just that the game set up incentives to be good, which it did. It was also that it built an almost human character in John Marston, and you wanted to live up to his ideals. And that was and you see that so rarely in video games, but it can work, I think, as Red Dead Redemption shows. And so you end up. And when you bring those benefits in, and I think this has always been sort of the libertarian case against why unfettered free markets won't actually produce problems, is that there are in fact if you choose quote unquote bad behavior, there will be consequences to it, and that there are sort of it's naturally reinforcing, and most video games haven't figured out how to create those natural reinforcements to incentivize people to do good.
Of course, the other thing is that, there's incentives to do good for yourself in Red Dead Redemption, but I think, one of the sort of atmospheric things in Red Dead Redemption is that there's almost always, when you're walking out of a saloon, at any time of day, there's some cowboy who is trying to rape some woman in the street, and you basically have a decision on whether or not to shoot that guy. And there's actually no reason to shoot him. Or not shoot. You don't really gain anything except for the personal feeling of.
No, there's just they're the fame and honor meters, and you get fame or honor from doing this. And so there's actually that's actually what's so great, is that video games end up always having to attach these numerical point values to everything. Everything in video games boils down to an economic decision. Maybe that's why sort of libertarians love them. But they're all economic decisions somehow or another. All interactions with humans end up being point values. Sometimes you see them, sometimes they're under the hood, but they're always point values. And Red Dead Redemption actually gives you a point value good score for doing good things. It gives you honor for saving people, a lot for doing the big missions, a little bit for sort of saving somebody while you're walking down the street. But that's, I think, what's so great about it, is that it has this sort of reinforcing system that it in fact pays to be more human. And then once your honor scale goes up, you get discounts at stores. It unlocks certain weapons, that sort of thing. So that you can kill bad guys more effectively. And so that, to me, is where video games need to be going, rather than sort of this thing that they've been doing, where in fact it's kind of awesome to play as a bad guy because there are no consequences.
Okay, so here's the other thing. I don't share Monica's sort of inner conservative thing, but I actually find it personally difficult to play the evil decision, to go the evil route in certain video games. I know some people think it's the only way to go, but there's plenty of video games like Fallout where I just can't be a bad person. I just feel terrible.
You're missing out on so much fun.
I realize it, but I don't even need the incentives. I'm due to external social pressure. I already have a hard time being a bad person in video games.
Well, I maybe that's in the end that's the sort of that's the difference between the two of us, and why our politics, despite our love of video games, does not entirely align.
Yes.
I think we're probably about finished up here, but it's been great talking with you.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's been a great time. We should do it again.
We should.
All right. Thanks a lot. Take care.
You too, sir.